You're enjoying your morning coffee when suddenly your left arm goes numb and your speech becomes slurred. You're completely alone, your phone seems miles away, and panic starts to set in. This nightmare scenario becomes reality for thousands of seniors every single day. But what if I told you that even in this terrifying moment, you hold the power to save your own life? What if those crucial first minutes don't have to mean the difference between life and death, but between thriving and merely surviving? Today, I'm going to share with you the life-saving secrets that emergency room doctors wish every senior knew by heart. Every 18 seconds, someone in America suffers a stroke. Every 4 minutes, someone dies from one. These aren't just statistics. On a medical chart, they represent our parents, our neighbors, our friends, and potentially ourselves. The most terrifying aspect of stroke isn't just its sudden onset, but the fact that it often strikes when we're most vulnerable, alone, unprepared, and caught completely off guard. Margaret was 74 years old when she learned this lesson the hard way. She was tending to her garden on a beautiful Tuesday morning when the world suddenly tilted sideways. The watering can slipped from her right hand, and when she tried to call for help, the words came out garbled and strange. Margaret lived alone, her nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away, and her cell phone was inside the house. In that moment, she faced every senior's worst nightmare: a medical emergency with no one around to help. What happened next would determine whether Margaret would see another sunrise or become another tragic statistic. But Margaret had something that many seniors don't. She understood that strokes don't just happen to other people, and she had prepared herself mentally for this exact scenario. The truth about strokes is both sobering and empowering. While we can't always prevent them, we can absolutely control how we respond to them. A stroke occurs when blood flow to part of the brain is interrupted, either by a blockage or a rupture in blood vessels. Brain cells begin dying within minutes, making every second precious. The medical community has a saying: time is brain. This means that the faster treatment begins, the more brain tissue can be saved, and the better the chances of recovery. Understanding the different types of strokes can help you respond appropriately. Ischemic strokes, which account for about 87% of all strokes, occur when blood vessels in the brain become blocked by clots. These are the strokes that can often be treated with clot-busting medications, but only if treatment begins within a few hours of symptom onset. Hemorrhagic strokes happen when blood vessels in the brain rupture, causing bleeding in or around the brain. While less common, these strokes can be equally devastating and require immediate surgical intervention. The warning signs of stroke can be subtle or dramatic, but they're always urgent. The medical community uses the acronym FAST to help people remember: face drooping, arm weakness, speech difficulty, and time to call emergency services. But there are other signs that seniors living alone must recognize: sudden severe headache unlike any you've experienced before, sudden vision loss in one or both eyes, sudden difficulty walking or maintaining balance, and sudden confusion or trouble understanding others. Margaret experienced several of these symptoms simultaneously. Her face felt strange and droopy on one side, her right arm had become completely weak, and her speech was slurred. But because she understood what was happening to her body, she didn't waste precious time hoping the symptoms would pass or wondering if she was overreacting. The psychological aspect of stroke survival cannot be underestimated. Fear and denial are natural responses to sudden illness, but they can be deadly when they delay treatment. Many seniors hesitate to call for help because they don't want to be a burden, they're embarrassed about their symptoms, or they hope the situation will resolve itself. This hesitation can mean the difference between a full recovery and permanent disability. Living alone doesn't have to mean facing a stroke alone. Preparation is your greatest ally, and it begins with honest conversations with your doctor about your stroke risk factors: high blood pressure, diabetes, heart disease, high cholesterol, smoking, and a family history of stroke all increase your risk. Age itself is a significant risk factor, with the likelihood of stroke roughly doubling every decade after age 55, but knowing your risk factors is just the beginning. The real preparation involves creating an emergency action plan that you can execute even when your thinking is clouded by fear or confusion. This plan should include having emergency numbers programmed into your phone with easy-to-remember names, keeping a phone within reach at all times, and even considering a medical alert device that can summon help with the push of a button. Margaret's story had a happy ending because she had done this preparation. When her symptoms struck, she didn't panic. She slowly made her way to her kitchen phone, dialed emergency services, and was able to communicate her situation clearly. She told the dispatcher her address, described her symptoms, and followed their instructions while waiting for help to arrive. Most importantly, she didn't try to drive herself to the hospital or wait to see if the symptoms would improve. The paramedics arrived within 12 minutes of her call, and Margaret was receiving treatment at the hospital within an hour of her first symptoms. Because she acted quickly, doctors were able to administer clot-busting medication that restored blood flow to her brain. 3 months later, Margaret was back in her garden, with only minor residual effects from her stroke. Margaret's experience illustrates a fundamental truth about stroke survival. Preparation and quick action can overcome even the most frightening circumstances. When you're alone and facing a medical emergency, knowledge becomes your companion, preparation becomes your strength, and decisive action becomes your salvation. The key is understanding that you're not powerless in these moments. You're the most important person in your own rescue. The human body is remarkably sophisticated in its ability to communicate distress, but it doesn't always scream when something is wrong. Sometimes it whispers, and learning to hear these whispers can be the difference between catching a stroke in its early stages and discovering it too late. For seniors living alone, becoming fluent in your body's emergency language isn't just helpful, it's essential for survival. Consider the experience of Robert, a 78-year-old retired engineer who prided himself on his logical approach to problem-solving. One evening while reading his newspaper, Robert noticed that the letters seemed to be swimming on the page. He removed his glasses, cleaned them, and tried again, but the words remained blurry and difficult to focus on. Instead of attributing this to tired eyes or needing stronger glasses, Robert recognized this as a potential warning sign he had learned about at his doctor's office. Vision changes are one of the most overlooked early warning signs of stroke. Sudden vision loss in one or both eyes, double vision, or the appearance of blind spots in your visual field can all indicate that blood flow to the visual centers of your brain has been compromised. These symptoms might last only minutes or persist for hours, but they should never be ignored, especially when they occur suddenly and without explanation. Robert's vision problem was accompanied by a subtle but persistent headache that felt different from his usual tension headaches. This headache seemed to wrap around his head like a band, and it came with a strange sensation that something was fundamentally wrong. He couldn't put his finger on what exactly felt different, but his body was sending him a clear message that something required immediate attention. Headaches associated with strokes often have distinctive characteristics that set them apart from ordinary headaches. They may come on suddenly and be described as the worst headache of my life, particularly in cases of hemorrhagic stroke. But they can also be more subtle, presenting as an unusual headache that feels different from your normal pattern. The key is recognizing when a headache doesn't fit your usual experience and trusting that instinct. Beyond vision and headache changes, there are numerous other subtle signs that your brain may be experiencing compromised blood flow, sudden onset of dizziness or loss of balance, especially when combined with other symptoms, can indicate that the cerebellum or brainstem is being affected. This isn't the mild dizziness you might feel when standing up too quickly, but a more profound sense that the world is spinning or that you can't maintain your equilibrium. Speech and language changes often provide the clearest indication that something is wrong. These changes can manifest in several ways: difficulty finding the right words, slurred speech, speaking in gibberish without realizing it, or suddenly being unable to understand what others are saying. Sometimes family members notice these changes before the person experiencing them does, which is why it's crucial for seniors living alone to be particularly attuned to their own speech patterns. Numbness and weakness deserve special attention because they can be both dramatic and subtle. The classic presentation is sudden weakness or numbness on one side of the body, affecting the face, arm, and leg, but these symptoms can also be more selective, affecting only the hand, or causing subtle facial drooping that might be mistaken for fatigue. The key test is to raise both arms above your head and hold them there for 10 seconds. If one arm drifts downward, this could indicate weakness that requires immediate medical attention. Robert experienced a combination of these symptoms. Along with his vision problems and headache, he noticed that his left hand felt slightly numb, and that his smile felt lopsided when he tested it in the mirror. Rather than convincing himself that these symptoms were unrelated or minor, Robert recognized the pattern and understood that multiple neurological symptoms occurring simultaneously required immediate medical evaluation. The challenge for seniors living alone is that these symptoms can be intermittent or mild, leading to the dangerous assumption that they're not serious. Transient ischemic attacks, or TIAs, are often called mini-strokes because they produce stroke-like symptoms that resolve within minutes or hours. However, TIAs are actually warning signs that a major stroke may be imminent. Studies show that about 1/3 of people who experience a TIA will have a stroke within a year, and half of those strokes occur within the first 2 weeks after the TIA. This is why Robert's decision to take his symptoms seriously was so crucial. He didn't wait to see if the symptoms would resolve on their own or worsen. Instead, he called emergency services immediately and described his symptoms clearly and calmly. He told the dispatcher about his vision changes, his unusual headache, the numbness in his hand, and the facial drooping he had noticed. The emergency response team arrived within 15 minutes, and Robert was in the emergency room within 45 minutes of his first symptoms. Brain imaging revealed that he had experienced a TIA, and doctors were able to start him on medications to prevent a full stroke. Because he acted quickly, Robert avoided what could have been a devastating stroke that might have left him with permanent disability. Learning to read your body's emergency signals also means understanding your personal risk factors and how they might influence your symptoms. If you have a history of high blood pressure, diabetes, or heart disease, you should be particularly vigilant about neurological symptoms. If you're taking blood thinners, you should be aware that headaches might be more significant than they would be for someone not on these medications. The most important lesson from Robert's experience is that you don't need to be certain that you're having a stroke to seek emergency medical care. If you're experiencing symptoms that concern you, especially if they're sudden, severe, or different from your usual health pattern, it's always better to err on the side of caution. Emergency rooms are equipped to quickly determine whether you're having a stroke, and false alarms are far preferable to missed opportunities for treatment. When you're alone and experiencing stroke symptoms, the feeling of helplessness can be overwhelming. However, there are specific techniques you can perform on yourself that can help maintain blood flow, reduce complications, and potentially save your life while waiting for emergency services to arrive. These self-rescue techniques aren't commonly taught, but they represent powerful tools that can make the difference between survival and tragedy. Dorothy, an 81-year-old former nurse, found herself in exactly this situation on a quiet Sunday afternoon. She was preparing lunch when she suddenly felt dizzy and noticed that her right arm had become weak. Having worked in emergency medicine for 30 years, Dorothy immediately recognized the signs of a stroke, but more importantly, she knew what to do next. The first and most crucial technique Dorothy employed was controlled breathing. When stroke symptoms begin, panic is a natural response, but it's also dangerous because it increases heart rate and blood pressure, potentially worsening the situation. Dorothy sat down immediately and began taking slow, deep breaths, inhaling through her nose for a count of 4, holding for 4, and exhaling through her mouth for 6. This technique, known as box breathing, helps activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which calms the body and reduces stress on the cardiovascular system. Proper positioning is equally important when you're alone during a stroke. Dorothy positioned herself sitting upright with her back supported, which helps maintain optimal blood flow to the brain. Lying flat can sometimes reduce blood flow to the brain, while standing increases the risk of falls if dizziness or weakness worsens. The ideal position is sitting upright with your feet flat on the floor and your arms resting comfortably at your sides or in your lap. One of the most powerful self-rescue techniques is the strategic use of aspirin, but only if you're certain you're not having a hemorrhagic stroke and you're not allergic to aspirin. Dorothy kept a low-dose aspirin in her kitchen specifically for emergencies. She chewed one aspirin tablet, which allows for faster absorption than swallowing it whole. Aspirin helps prevent blood clots from forming or growing larger, which is crucial in ischemic strokes. However, this technique should only be used if you're certain you're not having a bleeding stroke and you have no contraindications to aspirin use. Hydration management is another critical self-rescue technique that's often overlooked. Dorothy took small sips of water to stay hydrated, but she was careful not to drink large amounts, which could complicate treatment if she needed emergency surgery. She also avoided alcohol, caffeine, or any other substances that might interfere with emergency treatment or affect her blood pressure. The technique of systematic muscle activation can help maintain blood flow and prevent complications. Dorothy gently moved her unaffected limbs, flexing and extending her fingers, rotating her ankles, and doing simple shoulder rolls. This movement helps prevent blood clots from forming in the legs and arms, which can be a serious complication during prolonged immobility. She was careful to avoid overexertion, but gentle movement helped maintain circulation. Creating a calm environment is a self-rescue technique that affects both physical and psychological well-being. Dorothy turned off the television, which was broadcasting stressful news, and instead played soft classical music from her radio. She dimmed the lights slightly and removed any clutter from her immediate area that might cause her to trip or fall. This environmental management helped reduce stress and created a safer space for her to wait for help. One of the most important self-rescue techniques is effective communication preparation. Dorothy wrote down her symptoms, the time they started, and any medications she was taking on a piece of paper. She also wrote down her emergency contact information and placed it next to her phone. This preparation ensured that she could provide clear, accurate information to emergency services and hospital staff, even if her speech became more impaired. The technique of continuous symptom monitoring is crucial for providing accurate information to emergency responders. Dorothy checked her symptoms every 5 minutes, noting any changes in her strength, speech, or vision. She used simple tests like raising both arms, smiling in a mirror, and repeating a simple phrase to track her condition. This systematic monitoring provided valuable information about whether her stroke was progressing or stabilizing. Dorothy also employed the technique of strategic medication management. She gathered all her current medications and placed them in a bag to take to the hospital. She avoided taking any medications that weren't absolutely necessary, as these could interfere with emergency treatment. She also made sure to note the time of her last meal, as this information would be important for treatment decisions. The self-rescue technique of creating multiple communication pathways proved invaluable. Dorothy had her landline phone, cell phone, and a medical alert device. She tested all three to ensure they were working and placed them within easy reach. She also had a list of emergency contacts programmed into her phone and written on paper, ensuring that help could be summoned through multiple channels if needed. Perhaps most importantly, Dorothy used the technique of positive self-talk and mental preparation. Instead of focusing on fear and worst-case scenarios, she reminded herself that she was taking all the right steps and that help was on the way. She repeated calming phrases like "I am handling this situation well" and "I am taking care of myself." This mental technique helped her maintain composure and think clearly during the crisis. The combination of these self-rescue techniques proved life-saving for Dorothy. Emergency services arrived within 20 minutes of her call, and she was able to provide clear, detailed information about her symptoms and medical history. The paramedics noted that her vital signs were stable and that she appeared calm and alert despite her stroke symptoms. At the hospital, doctors were able to administer clot-busting medication within the crucial time window, largely because Dorothy's quick thinking and self-rescue techniques had prevented her condition from deteriorating while she waited for help. Dorothy's experience demonstrates that being alone during a stroke doesn't mean being helpless. With the right knowledge and preparation, you can take meaningful action to protect yourself and improve your chances of recovery. These self-rescue techniques require no special equipment or training, but they do require preparation and the confidence to act when every second counts. Having all the knowledge in the world about stroke symptoms and self-rescue techniques means nothing if you don't have a concrete plan for putting that knowledge into action when crisis strikes. The difference between seniors who survive strokes and those who don't often comes down to preparation, having a clear, practice plan that can be executed even when thinking is clouded by fear or confusion. Frank, a 76-year-old widower, learned this lesson firsthand when he experienced stroke symptoms on a Thursday evening. But unlike many seniors who find themselves unprepared for medical emergencies, Frank had spent months creating and refining his personal emergency action plan. This preparation would prove to be the difference between life and death. The The foundation of any effective emergency action plan is communication accessibility. Frank had programmed his landline phone with large, clearly marked speed dial buttons for emergency services, his primary care doctor, his nearest family member, and his neighbor. He had done the same with his cell phone, but he also kept a laminated card next to each phone with these numbers written in large print. This redundancy ensured that even if his vision or cognitive function was impaired, he could still summon help. Frank's plan included detailed information cards placed strategically throughout his home. Each card contained his full name, address, date of birth, emergency contacts, current medications, known allergies, and medical conditions. He kept these cards next to his bed, by his favorite chair, in the kitchen, and in his bathroom, anywhere he might be when symptoms struck. The cards also included a brief description of his emergency action plan, so that anyone who found him would know what steps he had already taken. The medical information component of Frank's plan was particularly thorough. He maintained an updated list of all his medications, including dosages and frequency, in a small notebook that he kept with his identification. He also kept a copy of his most recent EKG, a list of his doctors and their contact information, and a brief medical history summary. This information would prove invaluable to emergency responders and hospital staff who needed to make quick treatment decisions. Frank's plan included specific positioning and self-care instructions that he had practiced regularly. He knew exactly where to position himself in each room of his house to maximize safety and accessibility. In the living room, he would sit in his recliner with a pillow behind his back. In the kitchen, he would sit at the table with his back to the wall. In the bedroom, he would sit on the edge of the bed with his feet on the floor. These predetermined positions ensured that he would be stable and safe while waiting for help. The timing component of Frank's emergency plan was crucial. He had practiced his entire emergency response sequence multiple times, timing each step, to ensure he could complete it even if his physical abilities were compromised. He knew it took him approximately 2 minutes to reach his emergency information, call for help, and position himself safely. This practice meant that when the real emergency occurred, he could execute his plan automatically without having to think through each step. Frank's plan also included detailed instructions for emergency responders. He had created a simple document that he could hand to paramedics explaining his symptoms, when they started, what medications he had taken, and what self-rescue techniques he had employed. This document was written in clear, simple language that could be understood quickly by busy emergency personnel. The neighbor notification component of Frank's plan provided an additional layer of security. He had arranged with his next-door neighbor, Maria, to check on him if she noticed that his lights weren't on by 9 in the evening or if she didn't see him retrieve his newspaper by 10 in the morning. He had given Maria a key to his house and copies of his emergency information cards. This arrangement meant that even if he couldn't call for help himself, someone would likely discover him within a reasonable time frame. Frank had also prepared his home environment to support his emergency plan. He had installed motion sensor lights in hallways and bathrooms to prevent falls during nighttime emergencies. He had removed scatter rugs and secured loose cords that might cause tripping. He had placed emergency flashlights in multiple locations and ensured that his smoke detectors had fresh batteries. These environmental modifications reduced the risk of complications during a medical emergency. The practice component of Frank's plan was what made it truly effective. Once a month, Frank would run through his entire emergency response sequence, timing himself and noting any difficulties or areas for improvement. He would practice calling his emergency contacts, gathering his medications, and positioning himself safely. This regular practice meant that when his stroke symptoms began, his response was automatic and confident. Frank's plan included provisions for different types of emergencies and different times of day. He had slightly different procedures for weekday versus weekend emergencies, recognizing that response times and available resources might vary. He also had different protocols depending on whether he was dressed inside or outside. When symptoms began, this comprehensive approach ensured that he was prepared for any scenario. When Frank's stroke symptoms began that Thursday evening, his emergency plan proved its worth. He was watching television when he noticed that his speech had become slurred and his left arm felt weak. Instead of panicking or hesitating, Frank immediately began executing his plan. He reached for his emergency information card, called 911, and clearly explained his symptoms and location. He took a chewable aspirin, positioned himself safely in his recliner, and called his neighbor Maria to let her know what was happening. The paramedics arrived within 18 minutes and found Frank alert, calm, and able to provide detailed information about his symptoms and medical history. His preparation had prevented his condition from deteriorating and had provided emergency responders with all the information they needed to begin treatment immediately. At the hospital, doctors were able to administer clot-busting medication within the optimal time window, largely because Frank's quick and organized response had prevented any delays in treatment. Frank's recovery was remarkably successful, with only minor residual effects from his stroke. His doctors attributed his positive outcome not just to quick medical intervention, but to his preparation and immediate response. His emergency action plan had transformed a potentially devastating medical crisis into a manageable situation, where he remained in control throughout the entire process. The lesson from Frank's experience is clear. Preparation is your greatest ally when facing a medical emergency alone. A well-developed, practiced emergency action plan can overcome fear, confusion, and physical limitations to ensure that you receive the best possible care when every second counts.